So we're walking through a sermon series on our core values, talking about what's truly important to us as a church. These core values are not a sermon series, but they describe who we are and who we hope to be. And today we reach the fifth of the 5 core values, which is where they all should be leading. Radical hospitality, theological humility, seeing our lives changed in transformation, living together in community, ultimately should be values that push us outward into the community to love with compassionate generosity. I hope the first thing that people will say about our church when they talk about Harvard Avenue Christian Church is they'll say, they love people. They love our city. They care about the things that God cares about. They're concerned about ending suffering and mending broken hearts. Dalai Lama has said a lot about compassion and love, and I love this one quote from the Dalai Lama. He said that love and compassion are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. This is a text where we see this lived out in the life of Jesus. And actually, of all the passages I've preached in my 30 years, I have preached this passage more than any other passage other than the Christmas narratives and the resurrection narratives. Because I think in this story, we really get a heart of what it means to live with compassionate generosity. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. Let me pause here and say this. Whenever I'm preparing a message on Sunday morning, I think of this text and I realize that those of you who have walked in this room on Sunday morning have come a long distance and you've come hungry. And I get down on my knees many times during the week and say, God, will you give me something for people to eat? What a tragedy it is to be in worship and to leave hungry. Am I preaching to hungry people this morning? Because I'm hungry. I'm hungry for a word. And his disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus said. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground, and when he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied, and afterwards the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. After he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmatia. Who knows how that's pronounced? That's close enough. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Now I know you woke up this morning and the first thought in your mind this morning was, man, I hope when I get to church that David Emery is going to give me a big Greek word that he can't pronounce and I can't pronounce either. Raise your hand if you woke up this morning and wanted a Greek word. No takers? Well, here's the Greek word for compassion. I've shared this word before. Splaknazomai. Splaknazomai. The first part of that word, splachna, basically refers to our internal organs. What's inside of us, here. the gut, the stomach, the pit of our being. And so this word splagnizomai means to feel something so deeply, when we see a person in pain or suffering, that we feel it inside of us in such a way that we are forced to turn that feeling into an action. Splagnizomai, or compassion, means to suffer with. It's not pity, it's not sympathy, it's a verb. It's to move toward people in pain. Now, this word splagnizomai, compassion, is only used a handful of times. It's a rare word in the New Testament. Sometimes when it's translated in these stories, they'll put another word in, but they all mean the same thing. They all mean compassion. Sometimes pity, sympathy. Sometimes it'll say they were indignant, but the word means compassion. Here are 4 examples. First example, Jesus is traveling with his disciples, and a man struggling with leprosy sees him, runs to Jesus, falls at his feet, and begs him for mercy. Mark says that Jesus was moved with compassion, splagnizomai, for this man's suffering. And that Jesus reached out and touched the man, which was remarkable because in that culture, you did not touch lepers. You kept a distance from lepers. Mark in the NIV translates the word splagnizomai as indignant, saying that Jesus was indignant when he saw the man's suffering. What that means is that Jesus was so moved within his being for the suffering of this man that it made him angry. It made him angry to see his depth of suffering, and it made him angry that his community had ostracized him and forced him to a life of loneliness. Second example, Jesus was approaching the community of Nain. As he got near the community of Nain, he saw a handful of men carrying a stretcher, and on the stretcher was a dead boy. Walking behind the stretcher was the boy's mother. And Luke 7 tells us that the boy's mother was a widow, which means not only had she lost her husband, but now she had lost her son. Luke tells us that when he saw the boy being carried out on the stretcher, that when he saw the woman, the widow, weeping, Jesus was filled with compassion, splagnizomai, for this boy and for this mother. And Jesus walks over and touched the stretcher and the boy. At that moment, everyone was frozen still. Because again, in that culture, rabbis don't touch the dead because they're unclean. Third story, and a familiar one to all of you, was a story that Jesus told about a son who lost his way, took his father's inheritance and went to the foreign country, and he wasted it all on wild living. One day while he was eating among the pigs, he came to his senses and said, I'm going to go home and beg for mercy. Maybe my father will let me be a servant. And Jesus stunned his crowds because he says that when the father saw the boy coming down the road, splagnizomai, compassion he felt, stunned him because the man then ran down the road, didn't wait for the son, ran down the road, and in compassion wrapped his arms around his long-lost son, full-on hugged him, splagnizomai. It stunned the crowd because in that culture, you don't welcome lost sons home with compassion, but with contempt. Now, our story, what you may not know about this story, is that this story takes place twice in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus feeds 5,000 on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee. On the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee, he performs a miracle. He feeds 5,000 Jewish people. Then Jesus gets in a boat, goes across the Sea of Galilee to where the enemy lived, the Gentile. It's an area known as the Decapolis. The Decapolis were 10 cities, 10 Greek cities, where Roman and Greek immigrants lived. So imagine this crowd would be very different, the demographics of this crowd, different from the crowd on the Jewish side, made up of people considered enemies of his people. Jesus looked at them, saw they were hungry, not just hungry for food, but for meaning, for purpose, for hope, for truth, splagnizomai. And he took the loaves of bread and put it in their hands, again breaking with tradition. So compassion, when we think of compassion, compassionate generosity and what it means, this word splagnizomai defines it for us. It is to feel something so deeply inside of our being that we require ourselves to move towards someone who is in pain. And notice the character of Jesus. Jesus broke with religious tradition. Jesus broke the rules. Jesus was not defined by heartless religion that missed the needs of people. And he defined the character of God as being one that looks at suffering human beings with compassion, not contempt. Eddie Irvin was a member of my church in Louisville, Kentucky. I baptized Eddie Irvin. Eddie Irvin was hard to love and to be with. Eddie was confused in his mind, and honestly, he was a bit scary. Sometimes Eddie would stand in the foyer of the church between services and just smoke. I'd say, Eddie, you're not supposed to smoke in the building, but Eddie walked to the beat of his own drum. When you talked to Eddie, he always had a wild look in his eyes, and Eddie was just Eddie. There every Sunday. And I would watch people walk by Eddie. Eddie lived a very lonely life. One day, Eddie got up in the morning, walked out the door of his house. Eddie didn't own a car. Walked 2 miles to the Ohio River and walked out of the middle of the 2nd Street Bridge, climbed up on the rail, and leapt into the water below. They found Eddie's body 2 miles down the river. He was so lonely and so heartbroken without a friend in the world, he didn't even leave a note. Eddie did have a large family, and on the day of his funeral, a lot of people gathered, and somebody, not with contempt but with concern, said to me, David, do you think Eddie went to hell? They really asked me this question. It was more out of kindness than it was contempt. Do you think that because Eddie took his life that Eddie went to hell? And I looked at him and I said what I believe with every ounce of my being. I said, I don't believe a God of love would send someone to hell who took their life out of the pain and agony of their loneliness and their mental illness. I said, any God that would send someone to hell that spent their whole life living in hell is not a God I would choose to worship. I said, because this is a God of love and grace. That is not the God we see in Jesus. God does not have contempt for people in pain, but compassion. Excuse me, I'm going to tell you can I just say what I said on the funeral without offending anyone? Well, you be the judge of that. But I stood up and I was so worked up by this in this service, I said, somebody asked me today if Eddie Irvin went to hell. And I just stopped and said, hell no, Eddie didn't go to hell. Hell no, Eddie didn't go to hell. I said, when Eddie died, Eddie was welcomed into the loving arms of God, who loved him every day of his life. And Eddie spent his whole life living in hell because every single day we walked right by Eddie and never took time to feel pain with him. And I remember standing on that bridge where Eddie jumped and feeling splagnizomai. Pain for Eddie. But then it occurred to me, I was a few days too late. And I heard God say to me, David, you're too busy to serve me. You're too busy building a church. Your lips praise me, but your heart is far from me. Take away the scales off your eyes and remove the hardness of your heart, because you need to see the eddies before eddies leap. Maybe you don't want to hear that from me, but it's true, and we all can relate to that, right? We have a saying in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, no creeds but Christ. I made up a new one. Deeds before creeds. Deeds before creeds. Deeds move hearts, not creeds. In the Roman Empire, it was a very cruel and vicious world for the poor and suffering. Caesarea experienced famine and war, and then a plague in the 4th century. When the plague hit Caesarea, one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire at the time, everyone fled the city except for one group of people, the Christian community. They stayed behind to care for the sick and for the dying, not just their own, but others. And Eusebius, a church historian, wrote this about that event, said, all day long, some of them, the Christians, tended to the dying and their burial, countless numbers with no one to care for them. Others gathered together from parts of the city, a multitude of those withered from famine, and distributed bread to others and to them all. He then went on to say this, that the Christians' deeds were on everyone's lips, and they glorified the God of the Christians. Such actions convinced them that they alone were pious and truly reverent to God. My point is that no one cares about our creeds until they see our deeds. We'll never win the world to the way of Jesus unless we're absolutely committed to living the way of Jesus. Julian the Apostate was the last pagan Roman emperor. And he was greatly agonizing over the spread of Christianity across the empire. He recognized that the reason why this little sect of people had grown to a large number of people was because they practiced compassion. He wrote this and said this. He said, when it came about that the poor were neglected and overlooked by the pagan priests, then I think these impious Galileans Christians observed that fact and devoted themselves to philanthropy. They support not only their poor, but ours as well, and all men see that our people lack aid from us. Inspired by the Christian, Julian the Apostate then ordered his pagan priests to practice charity and kindness in an effort to revive paganism. Now, you may not be aware of this, but in those first 300-400 years of Christianity, in the Roman Empire, children who were born with defects or were the wrong sex or unwanted, it was perfectly lawful for citizens at that time in that part of the world to abandon their children at the dump and allow them to die. True. But because of the love and care that these early Christians had for the poor, and because they believed everyone was created in the image of God, and because of splagnizomai, they frequently visited the dumps to bury the dead children among their own, to care for them and adopt them as their own. And the reason we have orphanages in the world is because of these early 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century Christians who had splagnizomai for the unwanted and the undesirable. Sometimes we're very confused about this one phrase. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. no one comes to the Father except through me. And we read that in John's gospel, it does mean that the way to God is through Jesus. But that definition is way too small. Because when Jesus says, I am the way, what way is he talking about? He's not just talking about his cross. He's talking about the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is the way to the Father. What is the way of Jesus? The way of Jesus is touching lepers. The way of Jesus is touching the dead. The way of Jesus is caring for the orphan and for the widow. That is the way of Jesus. And I'm going to tell you something. If I hear one more person complaining during Christmas about the war on Christmas, I think I'm going to throw up. Because I'm going to be honest with you, Jesus doesn't need Merry Christmas on a coffee cup to proclaim the good news of Christmas. He just needs Christians to quit participating in a cultural orgy of materialism. There you go, there you got it. To praise him. Christians have to stop focusing on the wrong, trivial things. Martin Luther King Jr. called these concerns, these things that we worry about, the wrangling over theology, pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. If we're going to win the world to Jesus, we have to know and believe this one thing to be true. That they will not care that we believe if we are not committed in every single way as a church, heart, soul, and mind, to splagnizomai. Now, this is going to be the most unpleasant thing I'm going to say to you this morning. And you go, I can't believe you said that. Well, here it is. If you thought you came to church this morning to escape pain, you're mistaken. Now, I don't want you to feel bad when you leave or anything like that. But we don't become Christians to escape pain. We become Christians to feel pain. When we look at Jesus on the cross, we see his pain. What I mean is this, is that we become Christians so that that innate gift of compassion for the imago Dei, the image of God in every person, is activated and animated. We were all born with it. We were all born. It's a part of who we are as human beings. And so when we get in the presence of Jesus, we're not supposed to escape pain. We're supposed to feel it, to be moved by it, to move toward people with our deeds before our creeds. So Jesus, can I preach a little bit longer? Because I'm about to get rolling here. Listen to this. Right after he does this thing, they go, hey, Jesus, we're the religious people. Would you show us a miracle? Would you give us a sign that you're the Son of God? And the text goes, Jesus just sighed. What did I just do? That's religious people. We get lost in these dumb debates over all kinds of nonsense. The sign that the world is waiting on is splagnizomai. Compassion. Compassion. And so this morning we're here, and I say to you that Jesus is here in this room, and he's saying to us today, look around. Open up your eyes, church. Let me remove the calluses from your eyes. Let me remove the hardness of your heart. Look around and see that people are hungry. You give them something to eat. Jim McGee died about 2 weeks ago. We held his funeral here on Friday, and Jim McGee had a life saying, a life model that I'm now adopting as my own. Jim McGee said, someday is now. When someone would say, hey, Jim, let's go this and do this on that day, or let's take this trip someday in the future, someday we'll get together, someday we'll do this. Well, Jim would say, well, someday's now. And what he meant by that was like that, don't wait for someday to tell somebody I love you. Don't wait for someday to pursue a dream. Don't wait for someday, to meet a human need. Don't wait for someday to say I'm sorry. Because someday is now. And so I think when Jesus looks at his church and he sees us in the world and why he's put us here, I take those words to heart. Give now, serve now, hope now, splagnizomai now. And so as we look at the world, and he says, you give them something to eat. I heard Jim McGee this morning. Hey, David, tell him someday is now.